Hi guys, in this video we're going to look at two important Kontent.ai concepts, webhooks and Management API. So the Management API is part of a suite of Kontent.ai APIs and allows us, among other things, to write to the CMS. This is in contrast to the Delivery API, which lets us pull data from the CMS. On a side note, if you haven't seen my previous video on the Delivery API, I've included a link in the description below. So webhooks are a great way to extend Kontent.ai beyond its out-of-the-box capabilities and really are a gateway to the microservices architecture where a headless CMS like Kontent.ai interacts with other microservices. A webhook might update a search index service, or it might send content for translation to a third-party service and then update the CMS with the results. Hopefully this video will show you how simple it is to utilize webhooks and will give you some idea as to the potential of what is possible. The first thing we'll need to do is to create an API endpoint file. So we do that on the pages, on the API, and I'll call it webhook example. There's our blank file. We'll need to import a couple of things here, and I'll construct my very simple function which will give us our output. So going to keep it very basic. I'll just set a variable message just to have some output. So I'll say webhook worked, and do our output here, our response. Is our MSG variable. So let's build that, make sure our application is working fine. Great, and now we'll run it. And we'll be able to hit our API endpoint on the localhost 3000 URL there. Now the best way to test that is to use Postman. So I've already created a request here. You can see the request goes to localhost 3000 API webhook example, which is that file we just created. So this is a post. Let's click send and see what our output is. So there's our response. Webhook worked. The next step will be to set up our webhook in Kontent.ai. And for that, we won't be able to reference my local host, obviously. So we'll need to host this web application in a hosting environment. And for that, I've actually set it up in Vercel. So Vercel is a great hosting platform. It's got a great free plan as well if you're just a hobbyist. And it's generated this domain for us. So if I grab this domain here, I'll be able to access my application now via this URL. So the way we can test this is we can go back into Postman, and where we're pinging localhost, I'll just duplicate this request. I'll name it Vercel webhook example, and we'll swap out this domain here. So that's now, let's go HTTPS, there we go. Save that, and let's give that a test. So this is now hosted in an external environment. There we go, webhook worked. So this is what we'll be plugging into Kontent.ai, and then we'll build this example out a little bit further as well. Okay, so now we can create our webhook in Kontent.ai. So I'll jump into the CMS. I'll go into project settings and to webhooks here, and this is where we create our new webhook. A few things to note. So we give it the name, the URL address, so that's that API endpoint that we're hosting in Vercel. there's a secret key here, and there are some triggers as well that we can define which shoot this webhook off. In the description of this video, I've actually added a link to the documentation on webhooks. So have a read of that if you want to know any more about these things here. In our case, for this example, our trigger, we will be using a workflow step. So as part of the workflow, a content item will be propagated to a particular workflow step, and that workflow step will trigger this webhook to fire off. So the first thing we need to do is to actually create that workflow step. So in workflows here, discard this. I've got several workflows here that I'm working with. I've created a webhook demo workflow for this example, and I've got a step here that I've added. It is run webhook. So if we have a look at that, we can see it comes from the draft step, it transitions to the publish step, and the user role that can propagate this step is project manager, which is the role that I'm logged in as. So we'll confirm that. And the content type is a block. So it's a block content item that will create, that will trigger this webhook. So let's go back into webhooks and let's fill this in now. So we'll create this new webhook. Let's get the URL from Postman. So this is the one that we tested earlier. So we'll call it webhook example. We'll discard these, we don't need them. We're using the management API's workflow trigger. So run webhook, there it is. And I'll now save that. So that's our webhook set up. It's now linked to our workflow. What I'll do now is I'll go into content assets and I'll create a new content item. So in our case, we want block. You can see that's the workflow we're using, and I'll populate it. So we'll just fill this in. There we go. This is currently in the draft step. As soon as we move it to the next workflow step, so change workflow step, we'll move it to run webhook. That will now trigger our webhook as per that workflow definition. So let's go to project settings. We'll go to webhooks, and we've got this little debugging icon here, and this tells us what the webhook has been doing basically. So we can see here, anytime it's been run, we'll see that it's been run. So in our case, we just triggered it and we have a response of 200, and so that was delivered to our API endpoint. Now, in this webhook screen, we can also see what's happening with our webhooks when things go wrong. So this is a very useful place to begin our investigations. If something's not working correctly, we'll just go into debugging and we'll see that there's an error, like a 500, for example. And what I can actually do is I can actually simulate that by going into our code, and rather than returning this 200 response, what I'll do is I'll just comment this out. I'll change that to a 500, and I'll make the message something went wrong. So I'll save that, and what I'll do now is I'll check it into my GitHub repo and I'll upload it into Vercel, and then we'll see what that looks like when we hit this endpoint and get an error back. Okay, so I quickly paused while I did all that, and I was able to upload this change into Vercel. So now when we hit this API endpoint, we should get this 500 error. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So we'll go back into the CMS. We'll go back to our test content item, which is in draft mode again. And what I'll do is I'll now again, change it to this workflow step. So from draft to run webhook. And let's have a look now at what's happened. So we'll go to webhooks. And we see we've got a 500 failed. And we can see the response here. Something went wrong. So it's the response that we added. And we can also see the actual payload that was sent. So this is interesting to note because we'll be using this a little bit later on as I look at the management API, and when we get this webhook to actually write back into the CMS and update that content item. So this is the payload here that's being sent from the CMS to our API endpoint. Now we've seen how to hit an API endpoint from a webhook, but we haven't actually done anything more. So far the examples have been very basic. Let's have another look at the payload that's sent to our endpoint via the webhook. We have some interesting information here. The important bits of information to look at are, there's a list of items. So we've got the item ID here, we've got the language. We also have the workflow step that it transitioned from and the workflow step that it ended up on, being the trigger in this case. And we've got a message object here which provides us the project ID. We also have the operation. So this was the trigger for this webhook, which is a workflow step change. And lastly, we have the relevant API to that trigger, which in our case was the management API. So for the next step, we're going to build out the API endpoint and we're going to retrieve the content item ID that is passed to us from the webhook as part of the payload. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is to write some code so that we're working with a data structure that represents the payload that's sent by the webhook. So let's have another look at that payload here. So we're going to replicate this in code. So let me jump into Visual Studio and I'll just paste some code in that I wrote a little bit earlier. So as you can see here, we have the webhook notification interface definition. This in turn uses the data and the message interface definitions, and so it goes with the smaller details there. Now I'll make some updates to the code so that will respond with the content item ID. So this will be based on the payload that's coming from the webhook. So let me clear this message variable out. I'll reinstate this response. Now in here, so what I'm doing here is casting the request body as that structured data object below that webhook notification that we saw. And here, I've added some logic to get that item ID, as you can see, from our structured interface. And I'm setting that message variable to show that here. Otherwise, if it can't get it, no item sent from the CMS will be the response. So let's save this. Let's build it. Make sure it's all okay. Perfect. Now we'll run it, so we'll get it going on localhost. There we go, and we'll be able to now do a post via Postman. So going back to localhost, what we'll do is in the body, we'll put that payload. So let me go back into here. So I'm basically replicating what would happen if this came from the workflow there where the webhook is hit. So let me go back to Postman and we'll paste that in. So you can see the item ID. So this is what we should get below here. in our response as per the code I just wrote. So let's give that a test. There we are. That is our item ID coming through. So for the last part of this video, we're going to take things a little further and get our webhook to update the content item that's in our workflow step. For this, I'll update the block content type to have a new field, which is what will be updated. I'll install the Management API SDK from GitHub. And lastly, I'll code up the logic to do the CMS update for us. So the first thing I need to do is to install the Management SDK, because we'll be using the Management API to write to the CMS. We'll be making an update to our content item. So this is the GitHub repo. Get the installation text here. And let me go into Visual Studio Code and install that package. There we go. So that's now installed. So what I'll do is I'll paste in some code which initializes our client. Let me just get the import. There we go. Now we'll need to get the project ID and the API key. So I'll get that from the CMS. So in API keys, so we need our project ID. And we need the Management API key as well. There it is. Now, I always make a note to mention that you should be very careful with these API keys, keeping them safe and secure. In my case, I delete the project once my videos are published, so the keys are useless. But you should keep them safe and be cautious how you maintain and how you share them. So that's our client being initialized there. Now I'll add in some code to actually update our content item. And I've added a link to the description of this video to the Management API, so you can actually see in the documentation how you can work with the API. So we're updating by an item ID, which we get above, and we need to define the code name of the actual element, which we'll create in a moment, and the value that we'll be passing in. So let's go into Kontent.ai and let's update our content type. So we'll go to content model. So we were using block, and we'll add a field and we'll just call it response. Spell that correctly. Response. There we go. So we'll save our changes. We'll get the code name, so it's just response there, and we'll go ahead and paste that in where we need to. So code name is response, and the value will pass in, hey, we made an update from the webhook. There we go. So let's build that. Perfect. So now that we have the code in place and it's building correctly, I'll upload the changes into the Vercel hosted version so that our webhook is using the current version of this code with these updates in it. So once again, by using the magical pause button, I was able to pause and upload all our changes into Vercel. So now in our hosted environment, we've got the latest code with this latest functionality here. So our webhook will be able to utilize this and make the update to our content item. So let's jump back into the CMS, and we can see here in our block content type, we've got this response element that we created. So if I go into content and assets, So here's that test content item that we were working with earlier. You can see the response is empty at the moment. We're in the draft step within the workflow. So if I now change the workflow step to trigger that webhook, this response element should be updated with that value that we added in our code. So let's try that out. And we've got a notification here from the CMS that an element has been changed. If we refresh, there it is. Hey, we made an update from the webhook. Thanks for watching, guys. So two very important concepts we covered here, webhooks and management API. As the digital landscape becomes increasingly microservices orientated, the headless CMS not only plays a vital role in managing content, but ever more so in its ability to extend out where the CMS interacts with other microservices. The ability to both pull data from the CMS and also to be able to write data to the CMS is instrumental in ensuring that the headless CMS remains an integral part of the overall solution and helps with the flow of information rather than impeding it. Webhooks are an excellent way to facilitate this. Now, before I sign off, apart from webhooks, another great way to extend Kontent.ai is by using custom elements. I've added a link in the description below to a great video on custom elements made by my colleague and good friend Maarten van den Hooven. So please check it out. Utilizing both webhooks and custom elements will ensure that you're taking full advantage of Kontent.ai within your chosen architecture solution. Thanks, guys.